Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
They always said I was the dependable one. The mature one. The UV got this kid. The one who didn't need checking up on because I had things under control. That's what they told their friends, that's what they told each other, and I think eventually that's what they began to believe, because it made it easier to forget me, easier to dismiss my needs, easier to pour all their energy into Ethan. And I let them. At least for a while. Senior year hit hard. Not emotionally, not yet, that came later. No, I mean hard like in the face of a wall hard. It was FAFSA season and tuition talks and essays and decision deadlines, and I was balancing honors classes and after-school shifts at the diner, because unlike Ethan, I didn't have a shiny scholarship from a private school or parents who planned my college path with weekend campus tours and school-appointed counselors. I had Miss Fuller, the school guidance counselor who still printed things out on paper and told me she saw herself in me quiet, capable, underestimated. She handed me a stapled packet titled Critical Financial Aid Appointments and circled one date in red ink. March 12th, 9:45 a.m. My financial aid interview at the university I'd pinned all my hopes on Deerfield State. A solid public school, just far enough to feel free, just close enough to still come home if things fell apart. I told my parents 2 months in advance. I told them again a month later. I reminded them 3 weeks before. I even texted them the night before. See you both tomorrow morning. Don't forget your IDs. Can't do the meeting without at least one of you there. It was a formality, sure, meant to verify income, provide statements, clarify some grant options, but it was required. I couldn't go alone. They promised they'd be there. That morning, I wore a navy blazer I borrowed from my manager at the diner and shoes I hadn't worn since the winter formal. I skipped breakfast because my stomach was tight with nerves. I printed copies of our W-2s, tax returns, utility bills, everything Miss Fuller told me they might ask for. I sat in the waiting area of the admissions office, tapping my foot, checking my phone every 30 seconds. 9:30. Nothing. 9:40. Nothing. 9:42, my phone rang. Sweetie, my mom's voice crackled through the speaker. I'm so sorry. Your dad had a client emergency and we couldn't get out of it. Ethan's dorm move-in is next weekend and we couldn't swing both coasts. I remember the way the air stopped moving. The room didn't spin, but it thickened, like I was breathing through syrup. I glanced at the receptionist behind the plexiglass desk, then at the admissions officer walking toward me with a folder in her hand. I told my mom it was okay. I said it calmly. I even said, no worries, I'll figure something out. She sighed in relief, like I had done her a favor. Maybe I had. The admissions officer smiled at me. You ready? She asked. And I nodded, walking toward her like someone walking toward their own sentencing. We ended up rescheduling the meeting 2 weeks later. I brought a signed affidavit from my dad, and Miss Fuller managed to get on a Zoom call at the last second to vouch for my case. It wasn't ideal, but I held my own. I got the aid. Barely enough, but enough. Still, something had changed. Not just in them, but in me. Something hard, something sharp. I remember getting the acceptance letter in the mail and not even showing it to them for 3 days. When I finally did, my mom cried and said, "Oh, honey, we're so proud of you," and my dad rubbed my back and told me he knew I'd do great things. But in my head, I kept hearing that one sentence, we just couldn't swing both coasts. It didn't matter that Ethan was younger. It didn't matter that he was their only son, or that he had a double major lined up, or that he got into Columbia. What mattered, what would always matter, was that when I needed them in a moment that had real, lasting consequences for my future, they just weren't there. And when he needed help carrying boxes into a dorm room with catered move-in snacks and matching bedsheets, they booked a round-trip flight. I didn't say anything. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even pout. I said congratulations. I helped him pack. I drove him to the airport. I took their photo in front of the gate and said, "Smile big, it's a huge day." They smiled. I smiled too. But something inside me, something that used to feel warm and childlike and patient, went cold. I started thinking differently. About who I was to them, about what I meant. And I realized I wasn't the priority. I was the afterthought. The backup plan. The strong one they didn't have to worry about. So I stopped asking them to worry. I stopped checking in. I started making plans that didn't include them. And one of those plans, the biggest one, would come together exactly 4 years later. They would be standing at the entrance of a ceremony they assumed they were invited to. They would be dressed up, smiling, holding a card and flowers, ready to hand it to me after what they assumed was our moment. They wouldn't have tickets. They wouldn't be on the list. There would be security between us. And this time, I wouldn't say, it's okay. I'd just let them feel what I'd been feeling since that one call. That one missed meeting. That one unspoken answer they gave me. Because sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes silence is the loudest kind of revenge. I arrived at Deerfield State 2 weeks before classes began, hauling 2 second-hand suitcases, a single box of notebooks, and a fan that wheezed when it spun, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. The campus was bigger than I expected, sprawling with endless brick buildings and carefully trimmed hedges that made it feel like I had wandered onto someone else's carefully curated dream. And in a way I had. Because while other freshmen were unloading cars with parents and siblings who insisted on decorating dorm rooms like Bed Bath & Beyond catalogs, I was alone, carrying my life up 4 flights of stairs in a building with no elevator. Because my assigned move-in time didn't align with my parents' schedules. They had texted me the day before, something about Ethan's final checkup before his own move-in, and I hadn't responded beyond a simple okay. I didn't expect them to come. I didn't even want them to anymore. That desire, the aching hope for a gesture of presence, had died somewhere. Between the financial aid office and the curbside drop-off zone. The difference between being forgotten and choosing to be invisible is subtle, but once you make the shift, it changes how you carry yourself. I stopped updating the family group chat. I stopped calling on Sundays. I began carving out a space that was only mine, built not out of love or nostalgia, but out of survival. I shared a tiny dorm room with a girl named Rita, who was loud and sweet and always humming old R&B songs while curling her hair. She asked where I was from and why no one had come with me, and I smiled like it didn't sting when I said, just easier this way. Meanwhile, Ethan's name flooded my family's world like a sponsored ad campaign. My mom posted photos of him standing in front of Columbia's library, captioned with things like, "Our future world changer," and "So proud of our baby boy," while I watched from the background of their lives like a ghost. I wasn't jealous, not in the childish, I want what he has way, but I was angry. There's a quiet violence in being overlooked, especially when you've spent years being the steady one. The reliable one. The kid who never made a scene. I had done everything right and still, the spotlight landed on the one who never had to ask for it. Classes started, and I threw myself into them like they were lifeboats. I took extra credits, joined the pre-law society, and got a job at the campus library shelving books after hours, where no one talked and the silence suited me. I didn't go to parties. I didn't rush a sorority. I became, intentionally, the kind of person who no one noticed unless they had to. But I noticed everything. I noticed the girls with perfectly highlighted planners whose parents still paid their phone bills. I noticed the ones who called home and ended the conversation with, "Love you, Dad." I noticed every small kindness between families that I no longer received and might never receive again. At Thanksgiving, when the dorms cleared out and the halls echoed with emptiness, I stayed behind, claiming I had to work. My parents didn't press me to come home. They sent a "Happy Thanksgiving" text with a photo of Ethan carving a turkey and said they missed me, but it felt like the kind of thing you say because you should, not because you truly do. I deleted the picture without opening it. It was around that time I met Dean Alvarez. He was head of student affairs and one of the few faculty members who seemed to remember names. He caught me after a seminar and said, "You've got something sharp behind your eyes. Ever think about interning at the admin office?" I didn't hesitate. I said yes. I needed the hours, needed the proximity to power, and most of all, I needed something to focus on besides the slow erosion of whatever relationship I still had with my family. The internship wasn't glamorous. It meant spreadsheets and scanning ID cards, managing RSVPs, assisting with campus event logistics. But it also meant learning how the system worked. I learned who got priority seating at graduation. I learned how ticket allocations were managed. I learned that everything had a list, and I learned how to be on or off it. Slowly, I began to see the shape of something. Not a plan exactly, not yet, but the possibility of one. The real turning point came during winter break. Ethan got the flu, and my mom sent out a group text asking if everyone could send get well messages to cheer him up. I didn't respond. A few days later, she called, and when I let it go to voicemail, she left a message saying she was worried about me, that I seemed distant, that she hoped everything was okay. But the worry didn't sound urgent. It sounded performative. I imagined her saying the same words while flipping through a magazine or stirring something on the stove. And that's when it clicked for me, not just that they didn't show up, but that they truly believed I didn't need them to. I remember sitting on my narrow dorm bed that night, my roommate gone home, the window fogged with the breath of another snowstorm, and writing something down on a sticky note. Remember who was there. Remember who wasn't. I stuck it to my mirror and stared at it until the words stopped looking like language and started looking like a contract. Over the next 2 years, I stayed quiet but calculated. I stayed connected to the admin office, stayed close to the systems that organized recognition, tickets, awards, and logistics. I didn't flaunt my successes. I didn't announce my dean's list standings or my research achievements. I kept everything close, like cards pressed against my chest, waiting for the moment when they might matter most. And somewhere in that quiet space between being ignored and choosing not to care, the idea began to take shape. Graduation. The finish line. The one day where they might finally show up again, expecting applause, expecting pride, expecting to be seen as part of my journey. And that's when I decided they wouldn't be part of it. At least not in the way they imagined. I wasn't bitter. I was done hoping. I was planning. It started gradually, not as a decision made all at once, but as a slow retreat that unfolded over months, like a tide pulling back so subtly you don't realize how far it's gone until you look up and see the shoreline has vanished. I didn't wake up one day and cut them off, didn't throw a dramatic fit or deliver some kind of monologue about being neglected or overshadowed or unappreciated. I just stopped trying. I stopped reaching out. I stopped sending updates about my grades, my classes, my internships, the volunteer program I helped expand, the research project I got invited into, and the professor who pulled me aside one day after class and told me, in a voice filled with quiet certainty, that I had the kind of mind that could change things, legal systems, maybe, or policies, or people, if I chose to. I didn't tell them about that moment. I didn't tell them much of anything anymore. At first, they didn't notice. Or maybe they noticed and decided not to make a fuss, thinking it was just college life keeping me busy, or that I'd circle back when I had time. That's the mistake a lot of people make with the reliable ones, the independent ones, the kids who never asked for help. People assume that silence means satisfaction, that distance means contentment, that absence of need is the same as fulfillment. But it's not. Sometimes silence is exhaustion. Sometimes distance is grief. And sometimes pulling away isn't about wanting space, it's about realizing that no one's meeting you in the middle, so why keep walking toward them? The family group chat eventually dried up on my end. I stopped answering the constant stream of updates about Ethan's college life, his study abroad in Spain, his leadership award in the Pre-Law Society, the conference he got invited to in DC, and the many photos of him posing beside marble buildings or in lecture halls with other golden child types. My parents cheered for him like he was the center of their world, and maybe he was. I don't blame him for that. He never asked for that role, but he wore it well. He called home regularly, FaceTimed with our parents, sent photos, remembered birthdays, said the right things. I watched it all from a distance, not with jealousy, not even with resentment, just with the quiet ache of knowing that no matter what I did, I would always be the one who raised herself. I remember my birthday junior year, not because it was special, but because it was exactly the opposite. I had two back-to-back classes, then a late-night shift at the campus security office, helping with lost ID logs and end-of-semester cleanup. No party. No cake. No balloons or cards or even a call from home. Just a text from my mom at 8:52 p.m., nearly the end of the day, saying, "Oh no. Just realized what day it is. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Hope it's a good one." I stared at it for a few seconds, then typed thanks followed by a period, but deleted the punctuation because it felt too cold. I settled for a smiley face, the fake kind that doesn't mean anything. And that was that. Later that night, as I sat in my tiny apartment eating leftover noodles, I realized that something inside me had fully closed. Not cracked. Not broken. Closed. Like a door that used to creak open with hope and now had a deadbolt. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt finished. I started channeling everything into forward momentum. I stacked internships, joined every program that offered mentorship or networking, accepted opportunities that terrified me just so I could prove I could handle them. I was tired, often, and broke, always, but I didn't let myself stop. I think part of me believed that if I just kept climbing, one day I'd look down and the pain wouldn't be visible anymore. That the higher I went, the smaller they'd look from up there. By senior year, I had built a reputation in the dean's office. I was dependable, fast, discreet. I handled event planning, ticket tracking, vendor coordination, all the unglamorous background work that made university ceremonies run smoothly. Most people didn't notice me, but the ones in charge did. I never asked for credit. I just wanted the access. And that access became leverage when the email went out announcing limited guest passes for the upcoming graduation. Due to ongoing construction and overcrowding, the university was reducing attendance for the ceremony. Each graduate would receive only 2 tickets. No exceptions. No appeals. I read the email 3 times, then sat back in my chair and let a slow, steady idea bloom in my chest, equal parts relief and satisfaction. There would be no guilt now. No decisions to justify. No awkward phone calls trying to explain why I didn't want them there. The university had handed me the structure, and I would use it to my advantage. 2 tickets. Just 2. My roommate, the same one from freshman year, was graduating with me, and her grandmother, who had taken to feeding me during long weeks when I couldn't afford groceries, was flying in from Houston. She'd been more of a mother figure to me in scattered weekend visits than my own mom had managed to be over 4 years. I gave her the first ticket without hesitation. The second I reserved quietly, knowing I might offer it to one of my mentors or maybe no one at all. Maybe I'd keep it empty on purpose. A symbol. A space that didn't belong to them anymore. They still didn't know when graduation was. I hadn't told them the date, and they hadn't asked directly. I assumed they figured they'd get the details eventually, that I'd include them when the time came, that their inclusion was automatic. But I had already made the choice not to share it. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. If they hadn't walked with me through the hard part, they didn't get to stand with me at the end. A few weeks before the ceremony, Ethan called me. We hadn't spoken in months, but his voice was chipper, clueless as always. He asked about finals, said he heard I was graduating top of my class, something he'd picked up from a friend, and asked if Mom and Dad had booked their flights yet. I told him I hadn't sent out the details yet. He laughed and said, "Well, better hurry up. You know how they get about planning last minute." I said nothing. Let him fill the silence. When we hung up, I realized he would probably figure it out. He was smart enough, connected enough. He'd probably find the ceremony date online, maybe even request a list of graduates or ask someone at the registrar's office. I didn't care. Let them find the day. That didn't mean they'd find their names on the list. That didn't mean they'd be allowed in. Because this wasn't about forgetting to invite them. This was about choosing not to. By the time spring came around and the campus trees exploded into that brief, almost arrogant burst of bloom that made even the most exhausted students pause and take in the beauty of something other than looming deadlines. I had already rehearsed the details of graduation in my mind more times than I cared to admit, not because I was sentimental, or because I dreamed of cap-tossing photos on the quad or family dinners full of congratulations, but because I had engineered it all like a blueprint. piece by piece, over the course of a year, knowing full well that it would be the first time in my life I would get to fully control the narrative, to decide who stood at the edge of my accomplishments and who was left out of frame entirely. The ceremony was set for mid-May, and Deerfield's administration, still scrambling to finish a 3-year-long renovation project on the east wing of the stadium, announced that the audience would be severely limited due to safety constraints. Only 2 passes per graduate, no exceptions, no extensions, no standby list. It was a logistical nightmare for most families, who scrambled to decide which relatives would make the cut, who would stay home, who would settle for a live stream, but for me, it was perfect. It was, in every way, the hand of fate signing off on the plan I had drafted in quiet, calculated increments. 2 passes. Just 2. One of them, as I'd already decided, would go to Miss Fuller, yes. That same high school counselor who'd once stapled a financial aid packet together and circled a date that would ultimately reveal everything I needed to know about where I stood in my family's priorities. We'd stayed in touch, off and on, and when I called her that March and said, "Hey, I've got 1 ticket and I'd really like you to be there," she cried. Not the loud kind of tears, not the attention-grabbing kind, but the kind that come from someone who's watched you climb out of something and knows exactly how much it cost. The second ticket I offered to Mrs. Kaplan, my roommate Rita's grandmother, who had, without asking questions or expecting anything in return, left Tupperware containers of soup and pasta outside my door during exam weeks. Once slipped a gas card into my coat pocket when she overheard me mention I might not make it home for break, and treated me with a kind of warmth that wasn't dramatic or performative, but felt so deeply unfamiliar it sometimes made me want to cry in a way I didn't know how to explain. She never asked about my family, and I never offered answers. We just existed in a quiet understanding that kindness, when given without obligation, can feel like salvation. I didn't tell my parents the date. I didn't email them the time, the location, or even mention that I was graduating summa cum laude. When they called, and by then, the calls were infrequent, strained, mostly superficial, I answered politely, offered vague updates, and steered every conversation away from anything that hinted at logistics. I didn't lie directly, but I also didn't correct assumptions. At one point, when my mother casually said she was starting to look at flights around the 20th, just to be safe, I mumbled something non-committal and changed the subject. It wasn't hard. They were so used to me being low maintenance, so used to filling the silence with their own assumptions, that they didn't notice how little information I gave them. And I didn't feel guilty. Not really. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking them to show up. I was asking them to stay out of something sacred. But Ethan, predictably, didn't let it rest. He texted me in early May with a link to the university's commencement page and said, "Hey, saw the graduation date online, congrats again. Are Mom and Dad flying in Thursday or Friday?" I stared at the message for a long time, then responded with, "Not sure. Might be tight with the ticket limits." That was all I said. I didn't confirm or deny. I just let the ambiguity hang, knowing that curiosity would do the rest. And sure enough, 3 days later, I got a text from my dad saying, "We're booking the flight for Friday morning. Don't worry about us, we'll figure out the ticket situation when we get there." That was the moment I realized they hadn't changed at all, not in 4 years, not in 100 Sunday dinners or 1,000 missed conversations. They still believed they had access to me, automatic entry, as if being my parents was enough to earn a front-row seat in my life. They didn't ask if they were invited. They assumed. Because they always had. And that assumption, that entitlement, was the very reason I had built this plan to begin with. The night before graduation, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, even as the wind slammed against my apartment windows and my roommate tossed and turned beside a pile of half-packed boxes. I knew what the next day would bring, and I wasn't afraid of it. In fact, I was ready. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived on campus early, dressed in the robes I had folded and refolded until the creases sat sharp and proud along the arms. I walked past the stadium gates, nodding to the security team I'd worked alongside for over a year, many of whom greeted me by name. I handed off the final pass list, checked the seating arrangements, and made sure Miss Fuller and Mrs. Kaplan's names were written clearly on the badge envelopes. I thanked the staff. I shook hands with the logistics coordinator. I stayed calm. At 10:27, my phone buzzed with a call from a number I recognized but didn't save. Security. The man on the line said, "Hey, we've got two folks at the gate asking for you. Rick and Denise Thompson? They say they're your parents." I didn't speak for a few seconds. He asked again, gently, "Do you want us to let them through?" I said, without hesitation, "They're not on the list." "I'm sorry, but no." There was a pause. He didn't question me, didn't push back. Then he said, "Understood," and hung up. From across the lot, through the double-pane glass of the entry corridor, I could see them, dressed for the occasion, holding flowers, my father scanning the crowd with that old look of confidence that assumed he'd find me and all would be well, and my mother clutching a gift bag in both hands like a peace offering no one had asked for. Ethan stood a step behind them, glancing down at his phone, likely searching for my name on the program or figuring out how to talk his way past the barrier. I turned and walked the other way, toward the faculty entrance, the inner courtyard, the stage where my name would be called. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because regret doesn't happen in a single moment. It builds. It starts early. And by the time it arrives, full force, it's not loud, it's heavy. The auditorium filled slowly but surely, an echoing mass of polite chatter, shifting heels, camera flashes, and the careful clink of name-tagged folding chairs being adjusted and readjusted by volunteers who, unlike most of the crowd, weren't here for applause but for logistics. The air inside held the weight of 100 different stories converging on one ceremonial point, some marked by joy, some by relief, and a few, I imagined, like mine, marked not by celebration but by the quiet reckoning of long-buried disappointments finding their shape at last. I stood backstage behind a navy curtain that smelled like dust and fresh print programs, my robe pressed sharp at the collar, my honor cords resting heavy against my shoulders, and my name printed cleanly in the program's honors section. A name they hadn't bothered to confirm or ask about because they had assumed, just as always, that access and love were the same thing, that history guaranteed inclusion, that blood was enough to keep a seat warm. The crowd was already seated, the music starting, when I took my final position near the edge of the stage, just out of view, waiting for the signal that my speech was up next. The valedictorian slot hadn't been my original goal, not in the beginning. But when the nomination came, and then the vote, and finally the confirmation, I accepted with the kind of quiet, poised confidence that surprises people who have underestimated your ambition for too long. I didn't write my speech for a crowd of strangers. I wrote it for myself and for the two people in the front row who wore dresses and suits bought for a ceremony they weren't invited to enter. From where I stood now, the layout of the stage allowed me a sliver of visibility toward the side gate, just enough to see the heads of security still flanking the entrance, their body language patient but firm. The kind of posture that says this decision has already been made and you're simply the last to accept it. I saw Ethan standing there again, taller than I remembered, arms crossed with frustration he hadn't earned, likely rehearsing some speech about how I'd taken things too far. My father looked agitated, pacing in tight, tense half-steps, gesturing toward the gate, and then pointing back to his phone like the act of refreshing it would produce a digital ticket where none existed. My mother had stopped pacing. She stood still, holding the gift bag now against her chest like a small child hugging something breakable, her face unreadable at this distance, though I imagined it was wearing that same mask she always wore when faced with the consequences of something she'd long decided was someone else's fault. When my name was called, I walked onto the stage without hesitation. There was no stumble, no deep breath, no rush of adrenaline, just a stillness in me that felt final, not triumphant exactly, but resolved. The microphone was set at just the right height. I didn't need to adjust it. My first words weren't rehearsed anymore. They lived inside me like muscle memory, not because I had practiced them so many times, but because I had lived them long before anyone would ever hear them. I was once told that showing up is 90% of success. But I think the truth is more complicated. Showing up only matters when it means something, when it costs something. And some of the people who shaped me most didn't show up in the traditional sense. They showed up in quieter ways. In food left outside my door. In messages sent when I was too tired to ask for help. In the simple act of remembering. So today, I don't thank those who assumed I'd be fine. I thank those who made sure I wasn't alone while pretending to be. There was a pause, the kind that happens when a room doesn't know whether to clap or keep listening, the air heavy with the realization that this wasn't a typical speech. I didn't care. I hadn't written it to charm them. I had written it to reclaim something. I am proud of this degree. But more than that, I am proud of the silence I walked through to get here. Proud of the times I celebrated small victories alone. Proud of the absence I survived. And to those still waiting outside, thinking maybe someone made a mistake with the guest list, no. No one did. It was intentional. Just like everything else I've done since that morning 4 years ago, when I sat in a financial aid office alone because someone decided another child's milestone mattered more. The applause came slowly, not in a burst, but in a slow, building crescendo, people clapping not just because they were supposed to, but because something real had passed between us, something raw and unvarnished that couldn't be wrapped in bows or framed on a wall. I walked off the stage and into the hall that led back to the guest lounge, past bouquets of congratulatory flowers, past cameras, past handshakes and pats on the back from people who would never fully understand what had just happened, but respected the clarity with which I had delivered it. Miss Fuller was waiting there, mist in her eyes, but no words, because some moments don't need narration. Mrs. Kaplan was next to her, holding a tissue in one hand and a small thermos in the other, probably filled with the same chamomile tea she always swore cured everything. I hugged them both. And then I left. I didn't go out to the front lawn, where the other graduates were meeting their families. I didn't pose for photos in front of the campus sign. I didn't check my phone, though I could feel it vibrating in my pocket over and over, like a pulsing reminder that somewhere behind a locked gate stood 2 people who had finally, unmistakably, been denied access to something they never earned the right to assume was theirs. When I got back to my apartment, the robe hung across the back of the chair, and the cords draped quietly beside it. I finally checked my phone. 23 missed calls. 4 voicemails. A series of texts from my mother that started with confusion, turned to pleading, then apology, then silence. 1 message from my dad, sent just before the ceremony started. It read simply, "We didn't know." I stared at those 3 words for a long time, not because they shocked me, but because of how utterly predictable they were. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I whispered to myself the only truth that mattered. Yes, you did. Because that's the thing about regret. It doesn't arrive loudly, with fireworks or grand gestures. It doesn't always come with tears or apologies or even understanding. Sometimes it arrives in a locked gate. Sometimes it arrives in a missing name. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a daughter who no longer needs your approval or your explanations or your seat at the ceremony. And by the time you feel it, it's already too late to change anything at all.